Richard Parker had always prided himself on being the protector, the one who kept his family safe from harm. But when his younger brother, Ethan, fell under the spell of their manipulative stepmother, Helen, Richard's world unraveled in the most shocking way imaginable. One fateful night, the simmering tension between them all boiled over, leaving 2 bodies behind and a shattered family. The brutal truth: it was a secret romance between Helen and the 2 brothers that ended in bloody murder. In a small, quiet town surrounded by towering trees and rolling hills, the Parker family lived in what seemed like an ordinary home. Charles Parker, a successful businessman, had spent most of his life working hard to provide for his sons, Richard and Ethan. They had always lived a modest yet comfortable life, with their father being their guiding figure after the tragic death of their mother when they were young. Charles did his best to raise his sons with strong values, hoping to fill the void left by their mother's absence. But life took an unexpected turn when Charles met Helen. She was young, vibrant, and full of charm, and when she entered the family's life, things began to shift. Helen quickly won over Charles's heart, and before long they were married. Richard, the older of the 2 brothers, was wary of his father's new wife. There was something about her that didn't sit right with him. Helen was beautiful, but she seemed to possess a certain coldness that Richard couldn't quite understand. Ethan, on the other hand, was more easily taken in by Helen's kindness. She seemed to understand him in ways that no one else did, and for a time, things appeared to settle into a new normal. But Richard's suspicion of Helen only deepened as time went on. While his brother Ethan admired her warmth, Richard noticed how she subtly manipulated their father, always ensuring that she got what she wanted, whether it was a new car or a vacation to exotic places. It wasn't long before Richard began to sense that there was something more behind Helen's sweet smile. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he felt an unsettling energy in the house, a tension that grew with every passing day. Helen's relationship with Charles was complicated, and Richard could see the cracks forming. Despite her outward affection for him, he knew she had her own agenda. Helen wasn't just after a comfortable life, she was after something more. Richard began to see her in a different light, as a woman who wasn't simply his father's wife, but someone who was looking to secure her future at any cost. He began to feel a rising resentment toward her, and this feeling only intensified as he noticed the way she would look at him at times, a look that sent chills down his spine. Ethan, still young and naive, was unaware of the undercurrents of tension swirling around him. He continued to bond with Helen, sharing moments of laughter and connection. What he didn't realize was that his brother, Richard, was growing more isolated, struggling with his own complicated feelings about their stepmother. Richard couldn't understand how his brother didn't see through Helen's facade. He became convinced that something darker was brewing within the walls of their home. But no one would listen to him, and as time went on, he began to withdraw even further, becoming increasingly distant from his family. The house, once filled with the laughter of a close-knit family, now felt cold and hollow. The family's perfect image began to crack, and what had once seemed like an ordinary household was slowly becoming a prison of lies and deceit. The foundation of their home was built on shaky ground, and Richard could feel it. He knew that something was bound to break. The danger was already inside, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. But for now, it was just a quiet house where appearances were kept up, and no one dared to speak the truth. As the weeks passed, the tension within the Parker household continued to grow, though it remained hidden from Charles, who was often preoccupied with his work. Richard could feel the weight of the secret pressing down on him more with each passing day. The atmosphere in the house had changed, and he was no longer able to ignore the unease that lingered in the air. His suspicions about Helen had deepened, and it wasn't just her manipulative behavior that troubled him anymore. There was something else, something far more dangerous that he couldn't quite name. Helen, for her part, was becoming more and more comfortable in her role as the matriarch of the household. She had fully embraced the luxury and power that came with her marriage to Charles. But what Richard didn't realize was that she had begun to play a much more dangerous game. She had slowly begun to cultivate a kind of closeness with both of the brothers, in different ways. She knew how to make each of them feel special, unique, and needed. But what she didn't tell them was that her affection wasn't entirely genuine. She saw them as mere pawns in her larger plan to secure her future, a future that didn't necessarily include Charles. While Richard remained wary and distant, Ethan found himself drawn to Helen in ways that confused him. She had a way of making him feel understood, as though she was the only person in the world who truly saw him. She paid attention to his interests, his hobbies, his feelings, in a way that no one else had ever done. As their conversations became more frequent, Ethan began to grow closer to her, enjoying the affection and understanding she offered. What he didn't realize, though, was that Helen's attention came with an unspoken price, a price that he would eventually pay, but not yet. Richard, observing the growing connection between his brother and Helen, felt a knot of jealousy tighten in his chest. He couldn't understand why Ethan seemed so oblivious to the manipulation taking place right under his nose. Every glance, every touch, every word that Helen exchanged with Ethan filled Richard with a sense of dread. It was as if they were all caught in some twisted game that no one had agreed to play. And yet, despite his growing resentment, Richard couldn't seem to tear himself away from the situation. He was trapped in his own feelings, unable to stop what he feared was unfolding before him. One evening, as Richard walked through the house, he overheard a conversation between Helen and Ethan. It was innocent enough on the surface, but as he listened closer, he began to understand the depth of the manipulation. Ethan spoke to Helen with a kind of adoration that sent a chill down Richard's spine. Helen, in return, smiled and said things that made Ethan laugh, things that were just intimate enough to make him feel special, but not quite enough to make him realize the true nature of their bond. Richard stood in the doorway, feeling his anger swell. It wasn't just that Helen was taking advantage of Ethan's innocence, it was the way she seemed to control everything around her. Her ability to twist the feelings of everyone around her, to make them believe they were the most important person in her life, left Richard feeling completely powerless. The more he watched, the more he realized that his feelings for Helen weren't simply a matter of suspicion anymore. It was as though she had completely ensnared him as well, even though he had nothing to do with her. The more he tried to fight it, the stronger the pull became. Meanwhile, Helen was becoming aware of the growing tension between the brothers. She could see Richard's cold distance and Ethan's blind adoration, and she knew she had successfully created a wedge between them. What she didn't expect, however, was the growing complexity of her own feelings. The power she had over both of them was intoxicating, but she didn't realize that she was losing control of the situation. What had started as a way to secure a future had begun to turn into something far more dangerous. She was now playing a game she didn't fully understand, and the consequences of that game were yet to reveal themselves. The family, once united by blood, was beginning to tear apart at the seams. Richard and Ethan were both caught in Helen's web, each of them unaware of how deeply they were being manipulated. As the days passed, the lines between love and obsession began to blur, and it was only a matter of time before the situation spiraled beyond anyone's control. The simmering tension within the Parker household reached a breaking point when Richard stumbled upon a letter, one that would unravel everything he had feared. He had been rifling through his desk, looking for some paperwork, when his eyes landed on the neatly folded envelope. It was addressed to Helen, and the handwriting inside was unmistakable. It was Ethan's. Richard felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he opened the letter. It was a confession of love, a declaration of affection from Ethan to their stepmother, written in the kind of words that sent a chill through Richard's entire body. His hand trembled as he read through the lines, each word a knife to his heart. Ethan's feelings for Helen were not innocent admiration, they were deep, intense, and completely inappropriate. The letter spoke of longing, of stolen moments, and of an unspoken connection that neither of them had dared to acknowledge aloud. But the words were clear, and they struck Richard like a blow to the chest. He could no longer deny it. His brother had fallen in love with the woman who had slowly poisoned their family, and in doing so, had betrayed him in a way that Richard could never have imagined. Richard's heart raced, and a dark fury began to bubble up inside him. He couldn't believe what he was reading. The woman who had already torn his family apart had now ensnared Ethan, his own brother. He couldn't understand how Ethan could be so blind, so vulnerable to her manipulation. Richard had known from the start that something was wrong with Helen, but he had never expected this. The realization hit him like a storm. He was no longer just fighting against a manipulative stepmother. He was fighting against his own flesh and blood. As Richard wrestled with his emotions, his mind raced. He was torn between feelings of betrayal, jealousy, and rage. He had always been the older brother, the protector. But now it felt as though he had lost control of everything. Ethan, once the naive younger sibling, had become a stranger to him. The brother he thought he knew was now entangled in a twisted romance with Helen, and Richard couldn't figure out how to fix it. The distance between them had grown too wide, too deep, and it seemed impossible to bridge. Helen, for her part, was aware of Richard's growing hostility. She could feel the shift in the air, the coldness that had settled between them. But she didn't understand the full extent of Richard's feelings. She knew that he was watching her more closely, that his eyes lingered a little longer on her. But she couldn't fathom the depth of his anger. Helen's manipulation had always been subtle, calculated, but now it seemed like she had lost her grip. Richard's obsession with her, though veiled in suspicion, was now becoming something darker. He had begun to see her for what she truly was, but instead of backing away, his obsession had turned into something more dangerous. Ethan, on the other hand, remained blissfully unaware of the war brewing around him. He continued to bask in the attention Helen gave him, believing that their bond was something pure, something that could never be broken. He didn't see how Helen's affection for him was merely a tool to maintain her hold on the family. As the days passed, the tension continued to build, unnoticed by Ethan but ever present to Richard. It was only a matter of time before one of them would break. The house, which had once felt like a home, was now a battleground. Each room, each corner seemed to harbor the weight of the secrets and lies that had been carefully woven into the fabric of the family. Richard had lost his trust in his brother, his stepmother, and even in the life they had once shared. The feeling of isolation consumed him, and the anger that had been smoldering for so long finally erupted. The breaking point was nearing, and nothing would ever be the same again. The night that changed everything arrived quietly, but it was a night Richard would never forget. He had spent the evening stewing in his own thoughts, the letter still fresh in his mind. His jealousy and rage festered inside him, and his sense of betrayal grew by the hour. As he lay in bed, trying to sleep, the reality of the situation hit him with full force. His brother and his stepmother had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and in that moment, Richard knew that something had to give. The family, as they had once known it, was broken beyond repair. The night that had been building toward disaster finally arrived with an unsettling stillness. Charles was out of town for a business trip, and the house was quieter than usual. The tension inside the walls was palpable, thick enough to choke anyone who entered. Richard couldn't sleep. His mind raced with a combination of anger, confusion, and betrayal. The letter Ethan had written to Helen still burned in his thoughts, each word like a dagger to his soul. The image of his brother, so naive and wrapped up in the web that Helen had spun around him, consumed him. Richard couldn't stay in the house any longer. The feelings of rage were suffocating him. He paced through the darkened hallways, the creaking floors beneath his feet echoing in the empty house. Every step brought him closer to a breaking point, and he knew he couldn't hold back much longer. His world had shattered, and nothing could repair it now. He had to confront it. He had to confront her. Helen's bedroom door was slightly ajar, and Richard hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside. The room was bathed in soft moonlight, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Helen was asleep, her face serene and unaware of the storm that was brewing just a few feet away. Richard stood at the foot of the bed, staring at her. He had never felt such a combination of emotions: rage, jealousy, betrayal, and disgust. His own stepmother had turned their lives into a twisted game of manipulation and deceit, and his brother, Ethan, had fallen for it, completely blind to the danger they were all in. Richard's breathing quickened as he stared at Helen, his hands trembling. He knew he couldn't let things continue like this. He couldn't let Ethan be consumed by her any longer. Richard had always been the older brother, the one who was supposed to protect him, but now he realized that Ethan didn't need protecting from the world, he needed protecting from Helen, the very person who was supposed to be a mother figure to them both. But as Richard stood there, the weight of the situation began to hit him. He was no longer simply dealing with a stepmother who had manipulated her way into the family. He was dealing with a woman who had turned his own blood against him. The sense of loss was overwhelming. Not only had he lost his brother to this woman, but he had lost his family, the life he had known, and any sense of normalcy. All of it was slipping through his fingers, and he was powerless to stop it. Suddenly, the sound of a soft footstep behind him broke his trance. He turned sharply to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his face pale and confused. Richard's heart skipped a beat. The last thing he had wanted was to confront his brother tonight. Not like this, but now the moment had arrived. Ethan's eyes flickered between him and Helen, a look of concern crossing his face. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard didn't know how to respond. The question felt almost laughable. What was he doing? He was standing in the room of the woman who had torn their family apart, who had played them both like puppets, and he couldn't find the words to explain what had happened to them. How had they arrived at this point? How had it all gone so wrong? Without thinking, Richard grabbed the knife from the bedside table. It had been there, unnoticed by anyone else, but now it felt like the only thing that could give him control. The cold steel felt heavy in his hands as he looked at Ethan, who stood frozen, unsure of what to make of the situation. Richard's mind raced with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. The words he had wanted to say to Ethan, the anger he had held back for so long, it all surged up in that moment. "Ethan, you don't see what's happening," Richard said, his voice hoarse. "She's playing both of us. She's using you." Ethan shook his head, still not fully understanding. "You're wrong, Richard. She's not." Before Ethan could finish his sentence, Richard lunged. The knife flashed in the dim light, its blade finding its mark with a sickening force. Ethan gasped in surprise and pain as he staggered back. Richard's mind was consumed by a frenzy. Everything he had felt for months came crashing down in that one violent act. Ethan's shock and disbelief were written all over his face as he crumpled to the floor, blood seeping into the carpet. Helen, awakened by the noise, sat up in bed just in time to witness the horror. Richard's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment it seemed like everything slowed down. But then the rage that had built up inside him spilled over. He couldn't stop it. The anger, the betrayal, it consumed him. Helen tried to scream, but before she could, Richard turned on her. In a fit of uncontrollable fury, he struck. The woman who had woven this entire nightmare was now lying in front of him, just as lifeless as his brother. The house was silent again, but this time it was the silence of death. The family Richard had once known was gone. What remained was an irreversible tragedy, one that could never be undone. Richard stood in the center of it all, breathing heavily, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. In that moment he realized there was no coming back from this. The blood that stained the floor was a permanent mark, a symbol of the destruction he had unleashed. The family that had once been whole was now broken beyond repair, and there was no one left to fix it. The aftermath of the bloody night that tore apart the Parker family was a silence unlike anything Richard had ever known. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him with suffocating intensity. His hands, now stained with the blood of his brother and stepmother, shook uncontrollably. The house around him felt like a tomb, cold, lifeless, and empty. The family he had once known was gone, and there was no undoing the damage he had caused. Richard couldn't bring himself to look at their bodies. The sight of them lying lifeless on the floor was too much for him to bear. His mind raced with thoughts, questions, and the unbearable realization that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. He staggered out of the room, his body trembling with shock. His mind struggled to process what had just happened. His brother, his flesh and blood, was gone, his life snuffed out in an instant. and Helen, the woman who had deceived them both, was now nothing more than a cold, lifeless figure in that same room. Richard had thought he was protecting his brother, but now he saw the full scope of his actions. What had he done? There was no way to justify it, no way to explain it. The anger and betrayal that had driven him in that moment had led to irreversible consequences. Richard found himself standing in the hallway, his thoughts clouded by guilt. His heart pounded in his chest as he wondered what he was supposed to do now. Escape, perhaps? Run away from the wreckage he had created? He knew he couldn't stay there, not in that house that had been the scene of such horrors. The evidence was everywhere, the blood, the broken lives. He had left a trail, and there was no getting away from it. It wasn't just a crime that had taken place, it was the destruction of everything he had known. Richard was now alone, surrounded by the remnants of a family that no longer existed. He couldn't stay. He couldn't even bring himself to look at the place where it had all happened. As he stumbled toward the door, he heard a faint noise behind him. For a moment his mind refused to process it. He turned around, but there was no one there. The silence returned heavy and suffocating. Richard's thoughts turned to the one person who might have been able to stop him, his father. Charles, who had been out of town, was still unaware of the events that had unfolded in his absence. Richard couldn't imagine the pain his father would feel when he returned to find the carnage in his home. How would Charles ever forgive him? Would he even understand what had driven Richard to such an extreme? The thought of facing his father was unbearable. Richard didn't know if he could live with the guilt of taking 2 lives, or with the knowledge that he had shattered the family irrevocably. But the question remained, could he ever fix the broken pieces of his life? As the night wore on, Richard found himself wandering aimlessly, his thoughts a whirlwind of despair and regret. He didn't know where he was going, or if he could even outrun the consequences of his actions. The world outside seemed to carry on as if nothing had changed, but Richard's world was a fractured, shattered place. Every step he took felt like a step further away from the person he had once been, the person who had had a family, a future, and a purpose. Now he was a murderer, running from his past and the mess he had created. Days passed in a blur as Richard tried to flee from the inescapable truth. He went into hiding, cutting ties with everyone he knew, isolating himself in an attempt to escape the suffocating reality of what he had done. He couldn't bring himself to face the consequences, couldn't bear the thought of being caught, judged, and punished for the murders. But as time wore on, the weight of his guilt grew heavier. The memories of the night, the blood, the broken bodies, haunted him every moment. He couldn't escape the truth, no matter how far he ran. The media soon caught wind of the grisly events that had unfolded in the Parker house. Speculation and rumors spread like wildfire, and the town was left in shock. No one knew what had really happened that night, but the mystery of the Parker family's tragic end became the talk of every corner. Richard, now a fugitive, remained out of sight, but the whispers about him grew louder. The once proud family was now a symbol of tragedy, a story of betrayal, obsession, and murder. And Richard would never be able to escape the consequences of his actions, no matter how hard he tried. The story of the Parker family's destruction ended with an unsolved mystery. Richard, unable to reconcile with his guilt, disappeared into the shadows. His family's legacy, once built on love and connection, had been reduced to nothing but a shattered memory, and the world would never know the full truth behind what had transpired within those walls. What remained was only the chilling silence of a life lost to madness, and a haunting reminder that some broken things can never be put back together.